The rusty mailbox at the end of Willow Creek Road had been stuffed with overdue bills for months, but today it held something different, a letter that would change everything. Sarah Chen stared at the legal document through tears, her hand instinctively protecting her growing belly. Her estranged grandfather had left her his property, 30 acres of mosquito-infested wetland that locals called the Junk Lake. What Sarah didn't know was that her grandfather had been more than just an eccentric hermit. For 40 years, he'd been the keeper of a secret that powerful people would kill for. When 8-year-old Tommy started bringing home strange metal objects from his adventures around the murky water, Sarah dismissed them as trash. But Tommy's innocent discovery was actually the first piece of a puzzle that led to a hidden fortune. The problem: the previous owners of that fortune were still very much alive, still very dangerous, and they'd been searching for their lost treasure for decades. Now they knew exactly where to find it. What happens when a family's last hope becomes their greatest danger? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah folded the inheritance papers with trembling fingers, the reality of her situation settling like lead in her stomach. The apartment's eviction notice was taped to her kitchen table, bright pink and impossible to ignore. She had exactly 12 days to either pay 3 months back rent or find somewhere else to live. The wetland property was worthless. Everyone in town knew that, but at least it came with her grandfather's old cabin. "Mom, what's wrong?" Tommy appeared in the doorway, his school backpack still slung over one shoulder. At 8 years old, he had an unsettling ability to read her moods, a skill born from too many nights when Sarah couldn't hide her worry behind forced smiles. "Nothing, sweetheart," she managed, quickly wiping her eyes. "Just some paperwork about your great-grandfather's place." Tommy's face brightened immediately. "The one with the lake? Can we go see it?" Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Her son's excitement about their inheritance, if you could call it that, made the situation even more heartbreaking. How could she explain that the murky swamp he was imagining as an adventure playground was actually their last resort? "We might have to live there for a while," she said carefully, watching his reaction. "Really?" Tommy dropped his backpack and rushed to her side. "That's so cool! Is it like camping?" The innocence in his voice nearly broke her heart. Sarah pulled him close, breathing in the familiar scent of his hair, strawberry shampoo and playground dust. At 6 months pregnant and facing homelessness, she should feel nothing but despair. Instead, Tommy's enthusiasm sparked something unexpected: hope. "It'll be different from here," she said finally. "The cabin is old, and there's no internet or cable TV. But there's a real lake?" Tommy's eyes were wide with possibility. "Can I swim in it? Fish in it?" Sarah remembered her grandfather's stern warnings from her childhood. "Stay away from that water, Sarah. It's not safe." She'd always assumed he meant the usual dangers: deep mud, snapping turtles, maybe snakes. But there had been something else in his voice, something that had made her skin crawl even as a child. "We'll see about the swimming," she said diplomatically. "First, we need to check out the cabin, see what needs fixing." That evening, Sarah drove the winding road to her grandfather's property for the first time in 15 years. The for sale sign she'd passed 3 miles back was riddled with bullet holes, and the general store where she'd stopped for directions had gone quiet when she mentioned the Junk Lake. The clerk, a weathered man with suspicious eyes, had simply pointed toward the back roads and muttered something about Chen's folly. The cabin materialized through the pine trees like something from a fairy tale, if fairy tales included peeling paint, sagging porches, and windows thick with grime. But it was solid, Sarah realized with relief. The roof looked intact, and the foundation appeared sturdy. Tommy was already racing toward the water's edge before Sarah could stop him. The lake stretched before them, dark as coffee and perfectly still. Ancient cypress trees rose from its depths like the ribs of some massive beast, their Spanish moss hanging in ghostly curtains. "Look, Mum!" Tommy's voice carried across the water. "There's stuff down there." Sarah hurried to his side, following his pointing finger. Through the murky water, she could just make out shapes on the bottom, angular objects that didn't belong in nature. Probably old machinery or farm equipment, she reasoned. Her grandfather had been a collector of junk, after all. "Don't touch anything," she called out. But Tommy was already reaching into the shallow water, his face scrunched in concentration. When he straightened up, he held something that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It wasn't junk at all. It was a silver compass, tarnished but clearly valuable, with intricate engravings that seemed to shimmer in the fading daylight. The morning sun filtered through the dingy motel curtains as Maya scrolled through her bank account on her phone, wincing at the numbers staring back at her. $17.43. The night shift at the diner had barely covered their room for another 2 days, and Tommy was already stirring in the bed beside her, his wild auburn hair a stark contrast to the faded yellow pillowcase. "Mom?" His voice carried that sleepy confusion of childhood. "Where are we?" Maya set her phone aside and smoothed his hair back. "Remember what I told you yesterday? We're going on an adventure to see the land that Grandpa Earl left us." Tommy's eyes brightened, though Maya suspected his 8-year-old imagination painted a far rosier picture than the reality awaiting them. She'd never spoken much about her estranged father, the man who disappeared from her life when she was barely older than Tommy was now. The lawyer's call 3 weeks ago had felt surreal. Earl Dubois was dead, and somehow, impossibly, he'd remembered the daughter he'd abandoned. After a breakfast of gas station coffee and stale donuts, they loaded their meager possessions into her dented Honda and followed the GPS deeper into Louisiana's backwater parishes. The roads grew narrower, the pavement more cracked, until they were bumping along a gravel path that seemed to lead nowhere. "Are you sure this is right?" Tommy asked, pressing his nose against the window as cypress trees draped in Spanish moss closed in around them. Maya checked the GPS again. The blue dot insisted they were heading toward the coordinates the lawyer had provided. "I think so, baby." The path ended abruptly at a rusted metal gate hanging askew on broken hinges. Beyond it, a narrow dirt track disappeared into what could only be described as wilderness. Maya parked and stepped out, immediately regretting her decision to wear her only decent shoes. The ground squelched beneath her feet, and the air hung thick with humidity and the earthy smell of decay. "Wow," Tommy breathed, already out of the car and approaching the gate. "It's like a jungle!" Maya retrieved the folder of legal documents from the back seat, double-checking the property description. 43 acres of undeveloped wetland in Terrebonne Parish. The lawyer had been diplomatic but clear. The land was essentially worthless, more water than solid ground, accessible only on foot or by boat. The state had been after Earl for years to pay the back taxes. They picked their way along the muddy track, Tommy darting ahead despite Maya's warnings to stay close. The path meandered between towering cypress trees whose roots created a maze of natural bridges and pools. Water reflected the canopy above, making it difficult to distinguish between solid ground and swamp. "Mom, look!" Tommy had stopped beside a weathered wooden post driven into the mud. Faded numbers were barely visible through the moss and rot. "Is that our address?" Maya consulted the documents again. The numbers matched. This was it, their inheritance. She felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same crushing weight that had been her constant companion since losing her job at the insurance office. She'd foolishly allowed herself to hope that Earl's final gift might be their salvation, a chance to start over somewhere new. Instead, they were standing in the middle of a swamp with nowhere else to go. "Can we explore?" Tommy's enthusiasm remained undimmed by their circumstances. If anything, the wild setting seemed to energize him further. "Just stay where I can see you," Maya said, settling onto a fallen log to review their options. The motel money would run out in 2 days. She could try to find work in the nearest town, but they'd need somewhere to sleep, somewhere to call home while she figured out their next move. She watched Tommy hop from root to root, his sneakers sending ripples across the dark water. He'd always been fearless, curious about everything, asking endless questions she couldn't answer, like why his father had left before he was born, or why they moved so often, or why other kids had things that Tommy couldn't have. Tommy's voice carried from somewhere deeper in the swamp. There's something weird over here. Maya looked up from the documents to find Tommy 30 yards away, crouched beside what appeared to be another wooden post. But this one was different, cleaner, more deliberately placed. What kind of weird? She called back. But Tommy was already moving again, following some invisible trail through the cypress maze. The sound of splashing drew her attention back to where he'd been standing. Tommy had waded into knee-deep water, completely soaking his shoes and jeans, but his focus was entirely on something beneath the surface. "Thomas Michael Chen, you get back here right now." Maya stood, her mother's instincts overriding everything else. But Tommy didn't move. Instead, he reached down into the murky water and pulled up something that made him gasp audibly. "Mom," he called, his voice strange and excited. "You really need to see this." The morning sun filtered through the Spanish moss, hanging like ghostly curtains from the ancient cypress trees, casting dancing shadows across the black water. Maya stood at the edge of the property, her coffee growing cold in her hands as she surveyed what she'd inherited from her great-aunt Cordelia, a woman she'd met only twice in her entire life. 50 acres of Louisiana swampland stretched before her, a seemingly endless expanse of murky water, tangled vegetation, and mystery. The realtor had been brutally honest. The land was essentially worthless, too wet for development, too remote for tourism, and too wild for anything resembling civilization. Even the small cabin perched on the only dry patch of ground looked like it might collapse with the next strong wind. "Mom, can I go exploring?" Jake's voice carried across the morning air as he emerged from the cabin, his sneakers squelching in the soft earth. "Absolutely not," Maya replied automatically, then softened her tone. "This isn't like the park back home, sweetheart. There could be alligators, snakes." "But there's a boat!" Jake pointed excitedly toward a weathered dock where a small aluminum skiff bobbed gently in the dark water. "And look, there are paths through the trees. It's like a real adventure." Maya followed his gaze, noticing for the first time the narrow channels that wound between the massive tree trunks. Someone had been here before, had navigated these waters with purpose. The boat looked old but seaworthy, and she could see fishing gear stored beneath a canvas tarp. Her phone buzzed with another text from her landlord back in Chicago. The eviction notice was still hanging over their heads like a sword, and her job search had yielded nothing but rejections. Coming here had been a desperate move, a chance to figure out their next step without burning through the last of her savings on rent they couldn't afford. "Please, Mom, just for a little while? I'll stay close to the cabin." Maya studied her son's eager face. When was the last time she'd seen him this excited about anything? The past year had been hard on him too. The divorce, the financial struggles, watching her stress level climb higher each month. Maybe a little exploration wouldn't hurt as long as she stayed nearby. "Okay, but only if I come with you, and we stick together, no wandering off." Jake's whoop of joy echoed across the water, disturbing a great blue heron that had been standing motionless among the reeds. The bird took flight with a graceful sweep of wings, disappearing into the canopy above. They approached the boat cautiously. Maya tested the dock's stability before stepping onto the weathered planks, grateful when they held firm under her weight. The skiff looked old but well maintained, and she found a pair of life jackets stored in a waterproof container. "These first," she said, helping Jake into the smaller vest, "and we don't touch anything we don't recognize." The boat started easily, the small outboard motor purring to life with surprising reliability. Maya guided them slowly away from the dock, following the widest channel that seemed to curve naturally through the swamp. The water was darker than she'd expected, stained the color of strong tea by the tannins from decomposing vegetation. Jake leaned over the side, his reflection wavering in the dark surface. "Mom, look at all the fish." She glanced down and was surprised to see schools of small silver fish darting beneath them. and the occasional flash of something larger moving in the depths. This place was alive in ways she hadn't anticipated. They drifted past massive cypress trees, some so wide that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. Spanish moss draped everything like nature's own decorator had gone wild with garland. The silence was profound, broken only by the gentle lap of water against the hull and the distant calls of unseen birds. "There," Jake pointed ahead. "Is that a building?" Maya squinted through the dappled light and saw what he meant, a structure of some kind, partially hidden by vegetation and set back from the main channel. As they drew closer, she realized it was the remains of an old dock, much larger and more substantial than the one by their cabin. Beyond it, barely visible through the trees, stood the skeleton of what might once have been a boathouse or warehouse. The roof had long since collapsed, and vines claimed the walls, but the basic structure remained. "Wow," Jake breathed. "It's like a secret hideout." Maya felt an unexpected thrill of curiosity. Who had built this? When? And why so deep in the swamp? She thought of her great-aunt, Cordelia, the mysterious woman who'd left her this land. What secrets had she known about this place? "Can we go look?" Maya checked her watch. They'd only been out for 20 minutes, and her natural caution warred with a growing sense of intrigue. Maybe their worthless inheritance held more mysteries than anyone had imagined. The old woman's eyes seemed to pierce right through Sarah as she stood on the creaking porch of the weathered cottage. Mrs. Evangeline Thibodeau had to be pushing 90, her silver hair twisted into a tight bun, her dark eyes sharp despite the deep lines etched around them. "You'd be Sarah Chen," the woman said, her voice carrying a thick Cajun accent that made each word sound like music. "Heard you inherited old Beaumont's land." Sarah shifted uncomfortably, still processing how quickly word traveled in this small Louisiana community. "Yes, ma'am." "I'm sorry, but do we know each other?" "Child, I know everyone who sets foot in these parts. Been living here since before your grandfather was born." Mrs. Thibodeau stepped aside, gesturing toward the interior of her home. "Come in, we need to talk about that land you got." The cottage's interior was a fascinating collection of antiques, faded photographs, and what Sarah could only describe as mystical trinkets. Candles flickered on nearly every surface, casting dancing shadows on walls lined with old books and curiosities. The air smelled of sage and something sweetly floral. "Sit," Mrs. Thibodeau commanded, pointing to a worn velvet chair. "Tea? That's very kind. But I really should get back to my son. He's exploring the property and— That boy of yours found something, didn't he?" The old woman's eyes narrowed. "I can see it in your face. What was it?" Sarah's breath caught. How could this stranger possibly know about the locket? "I'm not sure what you mean." Mrs. Thibodeau poured steaming tea into delicate china cups, her movements deliberate and graceful. "Honey, that swampland been keeping secrets for near on 40 years. Time was bound to come when they'd surface again. What kind of secrets?" The old woman settled into her chair with a heavy sigh. "You know about the Beaumont family that left you that land?" "Only that it was my great-uncle Claude. I never met him." "Claude Beaumont was a good man, but he carried a burden till the day he died. See, back in 1983, there was a young woman named Celeste Broussard. Beautiful girl, sweet as honey, engaged to marry the sheriff's son." Mrs. Thibodeau paused, studying Sarah's face. "One night in October, she vanished without a trace." Sarah set down her teacup, her hands trembling slightly. Vanished. Like she'd never existed. Her car was found abandoned on the highway, but no sign of her anywhere. Search parties combed these swamps for weeks. Nothing. The old woman's voice dropped to almost a whisper, but Claude, he knew something. After that night, he changed, stopped talking to folks, kept to himself on that land like he was guarding something. "You think she's buried out there?" Mrs. Thibodeau's laugh was hollow. "Child, these swamps don't give up their dead so easy. But whatever happened to Celeste, your Uncle Claude knew about it. He'd come into town sometimes, looking like a man haunted by ghosts." Sarah thought about the locket, about Tommy's excitement over his discovery. Did Celeste have any family? Anyone still looking for answers? Her mama passed 5 years ago, but her younger brother Marcus still lives over in Vermilion Parish. He never stopped believing she'd come home someday. Mrs. Thibodeau leaned forward. That boy of yours, he's stirring up things that've been sleeping a long time. You need to be careful. Are you trying to scare me? I'm trying to prepare you. See, Celeste wasn't just any girl who disappeared. She was asking questions before she vanished, poking around in business that certain folks wanted kept quiet. Her fiancé, Deputy Jake Landry, he's Sheriff Landry now, been sheriff for 20 years. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You think the sheriff was involved in her disappearance? I think there's reasons why that case never got solved, and some of those reasons might still be walking around wearing badges. Mrs. Thibodeau stood, moving to an old wooden desk in the corner. She returned with a yellowed newspaper clipping. This here's from the week she disappeared. Sarah studied the photograph of a young woman with flowing dark hair and kind eyes. The headline read, Local woman missing after investigating corruption claims. Corruption? Celeste was a reporter for the parish paper. Small time, but she had big dreams. Word was she'd stumbled onto something involving missing drug evidence from the sheriff's department, money going places it shouldn't. Sarah's mind raced. If Tommy had found something connected to this woman's disappearance, they could be walking into dangerous territory. What should I do? Mrs. Thibodeau placed a weathered hand on Sarah's arm. Whatever your boy found out there, it's probably evidence. Question is, do you trust the local law enough to turn it over, or do you think maybe it's time someone else took a look at what really happened to Celeste Broussard? Sarah's hands trembled as she held the photograph up to the morning light streaming through their small kitchen window. The image was clearer now that it had dried overnight. A black-and-white portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and an enigmatic smile, wearing what appeared to be 1940s clothing. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "For my darling Thomas, until we meet again. All my love, Margaret." "Mom, who is she?" Tommy asked, spooning cereal into his mouth while studying the photograph with fascination. "I don't know, sweetheart," Sarah replied, though something about the woman's face seemed hauntingly familiar. "But we need to find out where this came from." After dropping Tommy at school, Sarah drove to the local library, the photograph safely tucked in her purse. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, had lived in the area her entire 73 years and served as the town's unofficial historian. "Well, I'll be," Mrs. Henderson whispered when Sarah showed her the photograph. Her weathered fingers traced the image gently. "This looks like Margaret Whitmore. Haven't seen a picture of her in decades." Sarah's pulse quickened. "You knew her?" "Knew of her, more like. She was before my time, but the story—" Mrs. Henderson paused, glancing around the empty library as if checking for eavesdroppers. Margaret Whitmore was the talk of the county back in the 40s. Beautiful young woman from a wealthy family in Charleston. She was engaged to some banker her father chose, but she fell in love with a local boy instead. "Thomas?" Sarah guessed, remembering the inscription. "Thomas Beaumont. He worked the shrimp boats, came from nothing. When Margaret's father found out about their relationship, he forbade her from seeing Thomas. But love finds a way, doesn't it?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes twinkled with the romance of it all. "They planned to elope, but something went wrong. Margaret disappeared one night in 1947, and Thomas was found dead in the marsh the next morning." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What happened to them? Nobody knows for certain. The official story was that Thomas had an accident while night fishing, but folks whispered that Margaret's father had something to do with it. As for Margaret, she vanished without a trace. Some say she threw herself into the marsh in grief. Others believe she escaped north to start a new life. Sarah thought about the chest Tommy had found, weathered and partially buried in the marsh mud. "Mrs. Henderson, did Margaret have any connection to Blackwater Marsh?" The elderly woman's expression grew serious. "That's where they found Thomas's body, and it's where Margaret was last seen alive. She leaned forward conspiratorially. There were always rumors that the young couple had a secret meeting place somewhere in those marshes, somewhere they could be alone, away from prying eyes. That afternoon, Sarah picked up Tommy early from school, claiming he had a doctor's appointment. Instead, they drove to the edge of their inherited property, where the solid ground gave way to the mysterious expanse of Blackwater Marsh. We're going treasure hunting again?" Tommy asked excitedly, pulling on his rain boots. "Something like that," Sarah replied, though her heart was racing for entirely different reasons. She'd brought a metal detector she'd borrowed from their neighbor, along with a proper shovel and some rope. The area where Tommy had found the chest was still marked by disturbed mud and cattail reeds. Sarah swept the metal detector in wide arcs, while Tommy splashed nearby, turning over stones and poking at interesting debris with a stick. "Mom, there's something else here," Tommy called out from a spot about 20 feet away, where an old cypress tree created a small, hidden alcove. Sarah hurried over to find Tommy pointing at what appeared to be the corner of another wooden container, this one larger and more deeply embedded in the marsh floor. Her metal detector began beeping frantically as she approached. Together, they carefully excavated around the object, working slowly to avoid damaging whatever lay inside. This chest was different from the first, older, more ornate, with brass fittings that had turned green with age. When they finally freed it from the mud, Sarah noticed initials carved into the lid, M.W. and T.B., Margaret Whitmore and Thomas Beaumont. "Should we open it?" Tommy whispered, sensing the gravity of the moment. Sarah nodded, her throat tight with anticipation. The latch was corroded but still functional. As the lid creaked open, they both gasped at what lay inside, stacks of letters tied with faded ribbon, more photographs, and beneath it all, something that made Sarah's heart stop. Jewelry, lots of it. Necklaces, bracelets, and rings that even to Sarah's untrained eye looked extremely valuable. But it was the document at the very bottom that made her hands shake as she lifted it out. A deed. A property deed to hundreds of acres of prime Charleston real estate, signed by Margaret's father and dated just days before her disappearance. And Margaret's name was on it as the sole beneficiary. The old leather journal felt warm in Maya's hands as she sat at her kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the window casting long shadows across its weathered pages. Tommy had found it wrapped in oilcloth deep inside the metal box, and despite decades in the swamp, most of the entries remained legible. "Property survey complete," she read aloud from the first entry, dated June 15, 1987. 23 acres of prime wetland, perfect for development once properly drained. Initial investment, $2.3 million. Maya's coffee grew cold as she turned page after page, piecing together the story of her inherited land. The journal belonged to someone named Richard Castellanos, apparently a developer who had purchased the swampland with grand plans for a luxury resort. The early entries buzzed with excitement about projected profits and construction timelines. But something had gone wrong. Environmental concerns mounting, read an entry from August. "Fish and wildlife breathing down our necks. Lawyer says we can fight it, but delays are costly." Tommy sat across from her, carefully cleaning the other items they'd discovered. He'd become obsessed with the treasure hunt, approaching it with the methodical patience of a much older child. Maya watched him work, marveling at how this adventure had transformed her usually scattered son into someone focused and determined. "Mom, look at this," Tommy said, holding up a small brass key. It was stuck to the bottom of the box. Maya took the key, examining its unusual shape. Unlike a house key, this one was ornate, with intricate scrollwork along its length. "What do you think it opens?" "I don't know, but it's important. It was hidden with everything else." Maya returned to the journal, searching for any mention of a key. The entries grew increasingly desperate as she read on. Castellanos had encountered permit delays, environmental lawsuits, and mounting debts. By October 1987, his tone had shifted from confident to panicked. "Bank threatening foreclosure," one entry read. "Project dead in the water." Sarah says we should cut our losses, but I can't walk away from everything we've invested. There has to be another way. Sarah. Maya noticed the name appeared frequently in later entries, always with an undertone of conflict. A business partner, perhaps, or maybe Castellanos' wife. Find anything interesting? Tommy asked, now sorting through a collection of old photographs they'd discovered in a plastic bag. Your great-uncle inherited this land from someone who lost a lot of money on it, Maya explained. This man, Castellanos, he wanted to build a resort here, like with pools and stuff? Exactly. But he couldn't get permission from the government. They wanted to protect the wildlife. Tommy held up one of the photographs. Is this him? Maya studied the picture. It showed a middle-aged man in an expensive suit standing next to a Mercedes, his arm around a blonde woman in designer clothes. Both were smiling, but their eyes held a hardness that made Maya uncomfortable. She flipped to one of the final entries, dated November 30th, 1987. Sarah's right. We're finished. Lost the property to the bank today. But they don't know about the safety deposit box. At least we salvaged something from this disaster. When the heat dies down, we'll come back for it. The coordinates are marked on the survey map, 20 paces east of the old cypress with the lightning scar. Maya's heart began racing. She grabbed Tommy's hand. Sweetie, when you found this box, was there a big cypress tree nearby? One that looked like it had been hit by lightning? Tommy's eyes lit up. Yeah. It was huge, and it had this weird black mark going down one side. Why? Before Maya could answer, the sound of tires on gravel announced an unexpected visitor. Through the window, she saw a black sedan pulling up to their trailer. Two people got out, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a younger woman with short auburn hair, both dressed in business attire that seemed out of place in their rural setting. Stay here, Maya told Tommy, closing the journal and sliding it under some newspapers. She stepped outside as the pair approached. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Ms. Rodriguez? I'm Frank Morrison, and this is my associate, Jennifer Walsh. We represent some clients who might be interested in purchasing your property. I'm not looking to sell, Maya replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Oh, we think you might reconsider once you hear our offer, the woman said. We're prepared to be very generous. Maya noticed how their eyes kept scanning the property, taking in every detail. I said I'm not interested. Morrison's smile faltered slightly. Perhaps you'd like some time to think about it. This is quite a remote area for a woman with a young child. Lots of things could happen out here. Accidents, you know. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Maya felt her protective instincts flare. I think you should leave. Of course, Morrison said, producing a business card. But do consider our offer. We'll be in touch very soon. The morning air hung thick with humidity as Sarah stood at the edge of the swamp, watching ripples spread across the dark water where Tommy had disappeared beneath the surface. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she counted the seconds. 15, 20, 25, too long. Far too long for an 8-year-old to hold his breath. Tommy! She shouted, her voice cracking with panic. She kicked off her shoes, ready to plunge into the murky depths after him, when his head suddenly broke the surface near a cluster of cypress roots 30 feet away. He gasped for air, treading water with one arm while clutching something against his chest with the other. His eyes were wide with excitement rather than fear, which only made Sarah's terror spike higher. Mom, you're not going to believe this, he called out, swimming toward shore with surprising confidence for a boy who'd only learned to swim at the community center pool last summer. Sarah waded in up to her knees, her work pants instantly soaked and clinging to her legs. The water was warmer than she'd expected, almost bathwater temperature, and something brushed against her ankle that made her skin crawl. Thomas Michael Hayes, you get over here right now, she commanded, using his full name in that tone that usually made him stop whatever mischief he was pursuing. But Tommy was too excited to register her anger. When he reached the shallows, Sarah grabbed him under his arms and hauled him onto dry land, her maternal instincts overriding everything else. She ran her hands over his head and shoulders, checking for injuries, while he squirmed in her grip. "I'm fine, Mom. Look what I found." He opened his palm to reveal what looked like a piece of jewelry, tarnished and encrusted with decades of swamp grime, but unmistakably valuable. Even through the green patina, Sarah could make out the intricate metalwork of what appeared to be a locket. Her anger deflated slightly, replaced by curiosity and a growing sense of unease. "Where exactly did you find this?" Tommy pointed toward the cluster of cypress trees where he'd surfaced. "There's this weird structure down there, like walls or something. And there's more stuff, Mom. Lots more." Sarah's mouth went dry. She thought about the stories Ezra had told them, about the history of this land that nobody talked about secrets that had been deliberately buried and forgotten. "Show me," she said quietly. They waded back into the swamp together, Sarah keeping one hand firmly on Tommy's shoulder. The water grew deeper as they approached the cypress grove, reaching her waist and Tommy's chest. Here, the canopy overhead blocked out most of the sun, creating an underwater twilight that made it impossible to see more than a few inches below the surface. "Right here," Tommy said, taking a deep breath and ducking under again. This time, Sarah followed him down, her eyes adjusting to the murky depths. What she saw made her blood run cold. Partially buried in decades of silt and vegetation were the unmistakable remains of a foundation, concrete blocks arranged in a rectangular pattern that could only be artificial. And scattered throughout the ruins were objects that clearly didn't belong to nature, the corner of what might have been a metal safe, pieces of what looked like furniture, and glinting among the debris, more jewelry and what appeared to be coins. Sarah's lungs burned as she surfaced, gasping. Tommy popped up beside her, grinning with the thrill of discovery. "It's like a treasure chest, isn't it?" he said. "Like pirates or something." But Sarah's mind was racing in darker directions. This wasn't some romantic pirate treasure. This was evidence of something that had been deliberately hidden, submerged beneath the swamp where no one would think to look. And given the apparent age of the items they'd seen, it had been down there for a very long time. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice tight with sudden fear. "But, Mom—" "Now, Tommy." Something in her tone finally registered with him, and he didn't argue as she guided him back to shore. But as they sloshed through the shallows, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The sensation crawled between her shoulder blades, and she found herself glancing back at the tree line that bordered their property. Was that a figure standing among the pines? The shadow moved, or seemed to, and Sarah's pace quickened until she and Tommy were practically running across the marshy ground toward their trailer. It wasn't until they were safely inside with the door locked behind them that Sarah allowed herself to really examine the locket Tommy had found. Using a kitchen knife, she carefully scraped away some of the grime, revealing an elegant piece of vintage jewelry that would have been expensive when it was new. More importantly, engraved on the back in delicate script, was a date, June 15th, 1962, and below that, barely legible but unmistakably there, were the initials, R.C. Sarah's hands trembled as she set the locket on the kitchen table. 60 years, whatever had happened here, whatever was buried beneath their swamp, it had been hidden for 60 years. The morning mist clung to the swamp like a shroud, as Maya led Detective Rodriguez down the wooden walkway Tommy had built with Earl's help. Her son bounced ahead of them, practically vibrating with excitement, while she fought the knot of anxiety in her stomach. What if the detective thought they were wasting his time? What if what Tommy had found was nothing more than old junk? "Mom, hurry up," Tommy called back, his voice echoing across the still water. "It's right around this bend." Rodriguez adjusted his footing on the slightly damp planks, his dress shoes clearly not designed for swamp exploration. "Your boy's got quite the enthusiasm," he observed, mopping sweat from his forehead despite the cool morning air. "He's always been curious," Maya replied, then added quietly, "maybe too curious for his own good." They rounded a cluster of towering cypress trees, their Spanish moss-draped branches creating a natural cathedral. Tommy had stopped at a small wooden platform Earl had helped him construct over a deeper section of water. Beneath the surface, Maya could make out the dark outline of something large and angular. There, Tommy pointed dramatically. See it? It's a car, but it's really old. And look. He grabbed a long stick and prodded at something metallic glinting just below the waterline. There's stuff still inside it. Rodriguez knelt carefully on the platform, peering into the murky water. His casual demeanor shifted instantly, replaced by the focused attention of a seasoned investigator. Son of a... he caught himself, glancing at Tommy. Well, I'll be. That's definitely a vehicle down there. Maya's heart began to race. Is it... should we be worried about... bodies? Rodriguez finished gently. Hard to say from up here. We'll need to bring in the dive team. He pulled out his phone, then frowned at the screen. No signal. This is pretty remote. Earl's got a landline up at his cabin, Tommy offered helpfully. He's the one who helped me find this. He knows everything about the swamp. Earl Thibodeau? Rodriguez's eyebrows shot up. Cajun fellow, lives alone out here? I've heard stories about him from some of the older officers. Maya felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What kind of stories? Before Rodriguez could answer, the sound of footsteps on wooden planks announced Earl's arrival. The old man emerged from the mist like something out of a ghost story, carrying a thermos and wearing his usual knowing smile. Thought you might need some coffee, he said, his accent thick as molasses. Detective Rodriguez, been a long time. Earl Rodriguez's tone was carefully neutral. Seems young Tommy here's made quite a discovery on his mama's land. Earl's eyes twinkled as he handed Maya a steaming cup. That boy's got a gift for finding things that don't want to stay hidden. Reminds me of his great-uncle. You knew my uncle? Maya asked, surprised. In all their conversations, Earl had never mentioned this connection. Knew him well. Jake Fontaine was a good man caught up in bad circumstances. Earl's expression grew serious as he looked down at the submerged car. Been wondering when someone would finally find that old Buick. Rodriguez straightened sharply. You know what this is? Course I do. Been watching over it for near 30 years, waiting for the right time. Earl's gaze shifted to Tommy, who was hanging on every word. Some secrets got a way of choosing when they want to come to light. Maya felt the world tilt slightly. Earl, what are you talking about? What secrets? The old man set down his thermos and pulled out a worn photograph from his jacket pocket. It showed two young men standing beside a gleaming car, the same model now resting beneath the dark water. Maya recognized one of the faces immediately from old family photos, her Uncle Jake, young and smiling, his arm around a man she didn't recognize. There's Marcus Webb, Earl said, pointing to the stranger in the photo. And before you ask, Detective, yes, he's the one folks been looking for since 1994. Rodriguez moved closer to examine the photograph. Marcus Webb, the name's familiar, but I can't place it. He was a whistleblower, Earl continued. Had evidence about some big corruption scandal, politicians, police, businessmen, the whole rotten mess. Was supposed to testify before a grand jury, but he disappeared the night before. Most folks figured he'd either run off or been silenced permanent-like. Tommy's eyes grew wide. Is he in the car? Earl's expression softened as he looked at the boy. No, little man. Marcus made it out alive, but he had to leave everything behind, including something very valuable that he entrusted to your Uncle Jake for safekeeping. Maya's mind raced, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly clicking into place. That's why Uncle Jake left me the land. He knew I'd eventually find... whatever it is. Smart man, your uncle. Knew you'd need it someday. Earl smiled sadly. And now the day's come. The metal box sat on their kitchen table like a silent witness to decades of secrets. Maya had barely slept, her mind churning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. Tommy picked at his cereal, stealing glances at the mysterious container between spoonfuls. We need to be smart about this, Maya said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug. If what's in that journal is true, then people have died protecting whatever's out there. Tommy nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity despite his 8 years. "But Mom, what if it's something that could help us? You're always worried about money." His innocent observation hit her harder than any accusation could have. She was always worried about money, about rent, groceries, keeping the lights on. The weight of providing for them both on a waitress's salary had worn her down to the bone. But was she desperate enough to risk their safety? Maya opened the journal again, studying Harold Clemens' careful handwriting. The entries painted a picture of a man torn between greed and conscience, someone who had stumbled upon something extraordinary and spent the rest of his life haunted by the choice he'd made to keep it hidden. "Old-timers say the land remembers everything," one entry read. "Maybe that's why I can't bring myself to tell anyone. Some secrets are buried for good reason." But other passages suggested something different. A discovery so valuable that Clemens had purchased the entire swampland tract to keep others away, then lived modestly while sitting on what could have been a fortune. "There's someone we need to talk to," Maya said finally. She'd been thinking about Mrs. Robichaud, the elderly woman who ran the bait shop near the swamp's edge. If anyone knew the local history, it would be her. An hour later, they pulled up to the weathered building that served as both bait shop and unofficial community center. Mrs. Robichaud was sorting through tackle boxes on the front porch, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun despite the humidity. "Well, look what the morning dragged in," she said, her Creole accent thick as molasses. "You're Clemens' niece, aren't you? Heard you inherited his piece of the bayou." Maya introduced herself and Tommy, then carefully broached the subject of Harold Clemens and the swampland's history. Mrs. Robichaud's expression grew thoughtful, then cautious. "Harold was a strange man," she said slowly. "Kept to himself mostly, but he'd come by here sometimes for supplies. Always asked peculiar questions about the old days, about what folks might have lost in the swamp during the bad times." "What kind of bad times?" Tommy asked, earning a sharp look from his mother. Mrs. Robichaud studied the boy for a long moment. "You got curious eyes, child, just like your great-uncle did." She settled back in her rocking chair. During Prohibition, this whole area was wild. Smugglers used the waterways to move liquor, and not all of them were small-time operators. There were some with serious money, serious connections. She paused, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Story goes that one night in 1929, a boat went down out there carrying more than just whiskey, but the men who were looking for it, well, they weren't the forgiving type. Several folks who went searching for that wreck turned up dead or just plain disappeared." Maya felt a chill despite the morning heat. "Do you think Harold found something?" "I think Harold found exactly what he was looking for," Mrs. Robichaud said. "And I think it scared him enough to keep quiet about it for 40 years. Man used to come in here sometimes, late at night, looking like he'd seen ghosts. Always bought the same things, rope, waterproof containers, that heavy-duty flashlight he carried everywhere." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a faded photograph. "Found this in some old papers last week. Figured you might want to see it." The black-and-white image showed a younger Harold Clemens standing beside what looked like a partially submerged wooden structure. Even in the grainy photo, Maya could see something metallic glinting in the water behind him. "When was this taken?" Maya asked. "Based on the clothes and the car in the background, I'd say mid-1960s, not long after Harold bought that land." Mrs. Robichaud fixed Maya with a penetrating stare. "Whatever you're thinking of doing out there, girl, you be careful. That swamp has a long memory, and some folks' descendants still live around these parts. Folks who might not appreciate strangers poking around old business." As they drove home, Tommy clutched the photograph while Maya's mind raced. The metallic object in the image could be anything. Part of an old boat, discarded equipment, natural mineral deposits. But combined with the journal entries and Mrs. Robichaud's warnings, it painted a picture of something significant hidden beneath the murky water. "Mom," Tommy said quietly, "I think we have to go back out there." Maya knew he was right. Whatever Harold Clemens had discovered, whatever had haunted him for decades, was still waiting in the depths of their inherited swampland. The question was whether they were brave enough or desperate enough to uncover it. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cypress trees as Sarah stood at the edge of the water, clutching the metal box they'd pulled from the depths. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked the corroded latch. Danny pressed close against her side, his eyes wide with anticipation. The lid creaked open with a protest of rusted hinges. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be oiled cloth, lay a collection of items that made Sarah's breath catch. The first thing she noticed was a thick stack of papers, yellowed with age but remarkably well preserved. Beneath them, something glinted in the morning light. "What is it, Mum?" Danny whispered, his voice hushed with reverence. Sarah carefully lifted the papers, her heart pounding as she recognized the official letterhead at the top of the first document. It's a deed," she said slowly, scanning the faded text. "To land. Lots of land." She flipped through the pages, her eyes widening. "Danny, these are property deeds to half the county." But it was the second document that made her sink onto a nearby log, her legs suddenly weak. "A mining survey," she breathed. "From 1952, she read aloud, her voice barely audible. "Significant limestone deposits, potential for extensive quarrying operations, estimated value." The number at the bottom made her dizzy. Danny tugged at her sleeve. "What about the shiny thing?" With shaking hands, Sarah reached for the object beneath the papers. It was a compass, but not just any compass. The case was solid gold, engraved with intricate patterns, and when she opened it, a photograph fell out. The black and white image showed a man in his 30s, wearing overalls and a wide-brimmed hat, standing next to a woman in a simple dress. Behind them loomed the very cypress tree where they now sat. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Thomas and Eleanor Beaumont, 1951. The truth is buried with our dreams." "Beaumont," Sarah whispered. That was the name on the deed that had brought her to this place. Her distant relative, the one who'd left her this supposedly worthless swampland. Danny pointed to something else in the box. "There's more stuff, Mum." Sarah found a leather journal, its pages brittle but legible. As she opened it, Thomas Beaumont's story began to unfold in careful handwriting. He'd discovered the limestone deposits while clearing land for farming. The geological survey had confirmed what he'd suspected. The land was worth a fortune. But powerful men in town had learned of his discovery and wanted the land for themselves. "They came in the night," one entry read, "threatened Eleanor, said if I don't sell for 1/10 of what it's worth, something might happen to her. I told them I needed time to think, but I've already decided. We'll hide the evidence and leave, let them have the surface. They'll never find what really matters." The final entry was dated 3 days later, hidden everything in the old cypress hollow. "Eleanor doesn't know about the underwater cache. If something happens to us, maybe someday the truth will surface. The land belongs to the Beaumont family, and the riches beneath it are our legacy." Sarah's mind raced as the pieces fell together. Thomas and Eleanor must have fled, but not before securing their claim to the mineral rights. These documents proved that the Beaumont family, her family, owned not just the surface land, but everything beneath it. "Mom, you're crying," Danny said, touching her cheek with a muddy finger. She was crying, but they were tears of hope, of disbelief, of overwhelming relief. "Danny, do you understand what this means?" He shook his head, still focused on the contents of the box. "It means we're going to be okay," she said, pulling him into a fierce hug. "More than okay. It means you can go to any college you want. It means we never have to worry about money again. It means—" A twig snapped behind them. Sarah spun around, instinctively pulling Danny closer. Through the morning mist, she could see a figure approaching across the water, moving carefully from cypress knee to cypress knee. As the person drew closer, she recognized the weathered face of Earl Morrison, the man who'd been so interested in her property. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying across the still water. "Looks like you found something interesting out there." Sarah's blood ran cold. She quickly closed the box, but it was too late. Earl had obviously seen enough to know they'd discovered something significant. "Just some old junk," she called back, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Earl laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. "Now, Sarah, We both know that's not true. Why don't you and the boy come on back to shore? I think it's time we had ourselves a proper conversation about that land of yours." The way he said it made Sarah's skin crawl. She looked around desperately, but they were surrounded by water, and Earl was blocking their only path back to solid ground. The morning sun filtered through Spanish moss as Maya stood at the edge of the swamp, watching Deputy Harrison's boat disappear into the mist. Her hands trembled as she clutched the waterproof case containing the photographs Tommy had discovered. Each image told a piece of a story she was only beginning to understand, a story that seemed to grow more dangerous with every revelation. "Mom, look what I found!" Tommy's voice carried across the water from where he'd been exploring near the old dock. Despite everything that had happened, her son's enthusiasm for their mysterious inheritance remained undiminished. Maya hurried toward him, her boots squelching in the soft earth. "Tommy, I told you to stay close after what happened yesterday." "But this is different," he interrupted, holding up what appeared to be an old metal detector. "It was hidden under some boards near the fishing shack. And it still works," he demonstrated by sweeping it over the ground, eliciting a series of electronic beeps. Maya examined the device. Unlike everything else they'd found, this metal detector appeared to be in remarkably good condition, as if someone had been maintaining it recently. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the implications. "Someone's been here," she whispered, more to herself than to Tommy. "Recently." Before she could voice her concerns, the metal detector in Tommy's hands began emitting rapid, excited beeps. He moved it in a careful pattern over a patch of ground near an ancient cypress tree, and the intensity of the signals increased dramatically. "Mom, there's something big down there," Tommy said, his eyes wide with excitement. "Really big." Maya knelt beside him, studying the area. The ground here looked different from the surrounding swamp floor, less settled, as if it had been disturbed sometime in the not-too-distant past. She thought about the photographs, about the newspaper clipping mentioning missing persons, about the fear in Mrs. Broussard's eyes when she'd warned them away. "We need to be careful," Maya said. But even as she spoke the words, she found herself curious about what lay beneath their feet. Their financial situation was desperate, and if there was something valuable buried here, something that could secure Tommy's future, how could she walk away? Tommy was already using a piece of broken board to scrape away the soft earth. Maya watched nervously as he worked, listening for any sounds that might indicate they weren't alone. The swamp seemed unusually quiet, as if the wildlife itself was holding its breath. After several minutes of careful digging, Tommy's makeshift shovel struck something solid. The metallic clang echoed across the still water. Maya's heart raced as she helped him clear away more dirt, revealing the corner of what appeared to be a large metal box. "Is it treasure?" Tommy asked breathlessly. "I don't know, baby," Maya replied, though her mind was racing with possibilities. The box was larger than she'd expected, roughly the size of a footlocker, and appeared to be made of heavy-duty aluminum. Unlike everything else in this moisture-rich environment, it showed no signs of rust or corrosion. Working together, they managed to excavate enough dirt to reveal the entire container. Maya noticed that it had a modern combination lock, definitely not something from decades past. Her unease grew stronger. "Maybe we should wait for Deputy Harrison to come back," she suggested. But Tommy was already trying to lift the box. "It's not that heavy," he grunted, managing to shift it slightly. "Mom, what if this is what those men were looking for? What if this is why someone wanted our land?" Maya had been thinking the same thing. The timing of the threatening phone calls, the men who'd been asking questions around town, the recent activity suggested by the well-maintained metal detector, it all pointed to someone actively searching for whatever was hidden on their property. The sound of an approaching boat motor made them both freeze. Maya grabbed Tommy's arm, pulling him behind the massive cypress tree. Through the hanging moss, she could see a small fishing boat moving slowly through the channels, its occupant scanning the shoreline with binoculars. It wasn't Deputy Harrison. The man in the boat was older, weathered, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Maya didn't recognize him, but something about his methodical search pattern suggested he knew exactly what he was looking for. When his gaze swept over their hiding spot, she pressed herself and Tommy closer to the tree trunk, barely daring to breathe. The boat continued its slow patrol for several more minutes before disappearing around a bend in the channel. Maya waited until the sound of the motor faded completely before emerging from their hiding place. "Who was that?" Tommy whispered. "I don't know," Maya replied, but she was becoming increasingly certain that their presence on the swampland had attracted attention they couldn't afford. The metal box sat partially exposed in the dirt, its secrets locked away behind a combination they didn't know. Looking at her son's expectant face, Maya made a decision that would change everything. "Help me get this to the truck," she said. "We're taking it home." The morning air hung thick with humidity as Sarah stood on the dock, watching Tommy wade through the shallow water near the cypress grove. 3 days had passed since they'd discovered the metal container hidden beneath the old tree, and she still couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle in the Spanish moss, every distant splash, made her pulse quicken. "Mom, look at this!" Tommy's voice carried across the water as he held up something glinting in the sunlight. Another piece of metal, corroded green with age. Sarah's phone buzzed in her pocket. The caller ID made her stomach drop. Detective Mills. She'd been expecting this call since yesterday, when she'd finally worked up the courage to contact the police about their discovery. "Mrs. Chen, I've looked into those items you brought in. We need to talk. Can you meet me at the station this afternoon? Is everything okay? I mean, was I right to bring them to you?" There was a pause. "Let's just say you did the right thing. 2 o'clock?" After hanging up, Sarah called Tommy back to shore. His clothes were soaked and his sneakers squelched with each step, but his eyes blazed with excitement as he showed her his latest find, a brass compass, its glass face cracked but the needle still trembling toward magnetic north. "It's like a treasure map, Mom. What if there's more stuff down there?" Sarah knelt beside him, brushing a strand of wet hair from his forehead. "Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully. We're going to take a break from exploring for a few days." His face fell. "But why? Did I do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart. You've done everything right. It's just, sometimes when you find old things, especially things that might have belonged to someone else, you have to let the grown-ups figure out what to do next." As they walked back toward the cabin, Sarah noticed fresh tire tracks in the mud near the main road. The treads were wide, like those from a truck or SUV. She made a mental note to mention it to Detective Mills. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant. Detective Mills, a weathered woman in her 50s with kind but sharp eyes, led Sarah to a small conference room where the items from the container were spread across a metal table. "Tell me again exactly where your son found these," Mills said, settling into a chair across from Sarah. Sarah repeated the story, watching as the detective made notes. "Have we done something wrong? I mean, legally, is this our property since it was found on our land?" Mills leaned back in her chair. "That's complicated. What I can tell you is that these items match evidence from a case that's been cold for over 20 years. A missing person case." Sarah's breath caught. Missing person? Robert Henley, local businessman who disappeared in 1999. His wife reported him missing after he failed to come home from what he said was a fishing trip. His boat was found drifting empty in the main channel, but his body was never recovered. "You think he died on our property?" "We don't know yet. But some of these items, the watch, the wallet, they definitely belonged to him. The serial numbers match what his wife provided back then." Sarah stared at the corroded watch face, its hands frozen at 11:47. "His wife? Is she still alive?" "Margaret Henley. She's in her 70s now, lives in town. She's been waiting 23 years for answers about what happened to her husband." The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders. "What happens now?" "We'll need to search the area where your son found these items. With your permission, of course. And we'll need to interview Tommy, just to get his account of exactly where and how he found everything. Sarah nodded, then hesitated. Detective, there's something else. I think someone might be watching our property. I've seen tire tracks, and sometimes I get the feeling we're not alone out there. Mill's expression sharpened. Any idea who? Not really. But we're pretty isolated, and these tracks looked fresh. I'll have patrol cars increase their presence in the area. In the meantime, you and Tommy should probably stay close to the cabin. Maybe find some indoor activities for a few days. As Sarah drove home, her mind raced with questions. Who was Robert Henley, and what had really happened to him on their property? Had his death been accidental or something more sinister? And if someone was indeed watching them, did they know about Tommy's discovery? The sun was setting as she pulled into their driveway, painting the swamp in shades of gold and crimson. Tommy was waiting on the porch, and she could see he'd been busy. Spread around him were drawings of all the items they'd found, labeled in his careful 8-year-old handwriting. "I made a record," he announced proudly, "like real explorers do." Sarah smiled despite her worry. "That's perfect, sweetheart. Detective Mills is going to want to see those." As darkness fell over the swamp, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet new life was about to become much more complicated. The morning sun cast long shadows across the swampland as Maya stood at the edge of the murky water, her phone pressed against her ear. Sheriff Dubois' voice crackled through the speaker, barely audible over the distant sound of approaching vehicles. "They're about 10 minutes out," he said, his tone grim. "Black SUVs, government plates. I tried to buy you more time, but they're not taking no for an answer." Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. Behind her, Tommy sat cross-legged on a fallen log, carefully examining another piece of the strange metal they'd pulled from the water. His small fingers traced the intricate symbols etched into its surface, completely absorbed in his discovery. "What do I do?" Maya whispered, turning away from her son. "If they take this from us—" "Listen to me carefully," Sheriff Dubois interrupted. "My grandfather used to tell stories about these swamps. Said there were places where the old Acadians hid things during the deportation, places that wouldn't show up on any modern survey. If what you found is what I think it is, you need to document everything before they arrive." Maya's mind raced. She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of the metal fragments scattered around their makeshift camp. Tommy looked up, sensing her urgency. "Mama, what's wrong?" "Nothing, sweetheart. Just keep looking at those pieces, okay? Tell me what you see." Tommy nodded and returned his attention to the artifact in his hands. "This one's different from the others. The marks look like a map, maybe? See these squiggly lines? They look like the creek that runs through our backyard." Maya's breath caught. She knelt beside Tommy, studying the metal fragment more closely. The etched lines did indeed resemble the waterways that crisscrossed their property. But there was something else. Small X marks scattered across the surface. "Tommy, you're brilliant," she breathed. "It is a map." The distant rumble of engines grew louder. Maya grabbed her phone and called the one person she hoped might have answers. "Eleanor? It's Maya Chen. I need to ask you about my great-aunt's property." The elderly woman's voice was sharp despite the early hour. "Child, what are you doing calling me at dawn? Did Aunt Iris ever mention finding anything unusual in the swamp? Anything old, maybe valuable?" A long pause. Then Eleanor's voice, quieter now. "Your aunt came to see me about 3 months before she passed. Brought some old photographs, said she'd been researching the history of her land. Something about French settlers and a missing ship." Maya's pulse quickened. "What kind of ship?" "Spanish treasure vessel, if I remember right. Went missing in these waters back in the 1700s. Your aunt believed it had been carrying more than just gold, documents, artifacts, things that certain people might want to keep buried." The sound of vehicles turning onto the dirt road made Maya's stomach drop. She could see dust clouds rising through the trees. "Eleanor, I have to go. But if something happens to me, if Tommy and I disappear, or if there's some kind of accident—" "Maya Chen, you listen to me. Your aunt didn't trust banks or lawyers, but she trusted the land. Whatever she wanted to keep safe, she would have hidden it where only family could find it. Look for the old cypress with the lightning scar. She used to sit there for hours. The line went dead just as 3 black SUVs pulled into view. Maya grabbed Tommy's hand and the metal fragments, stuffing them into her backpack. We need to move now. But Mama, trust me, baby. They plunged deeper into the swamp, following a narrow path that Maya barely remembered from her childhood visits. Behind them, car doors slammed, and voices shouted orders. Heavy footsteps crashed through the underbrush. Tommy kept pace beside her, his small legs working hard to match her stride. Are we in trouble? Not trouble exactly. But some people want to take away what we found, and I don't think they have the right to do that. They reached a small island in the middle of the swamp, dominated by an enormous cypress tree. A jagged scar ran down its trunk where lightning had struck years ago, leaving the bark blackened but the tree alive. Maya circled the massive trunk, running her hands over the rough bark. Near the base, hidden beneath a tangle of Spanish moss, her fingers found something unexpected, a small metal box wedged deep into a hollow in the tree. "Mama, they're getting closer," Tommy whispered, pointing back toward the sounds of pursuit. Maya pulled the box free. It was heavier than she'd expected, and older than anything they'd found in the water. Symbols covered its surface, matching those on the metal fragments Tommy had discovered. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived decades of humidity, was a leather journal and a collection of photographs. The first page of the journal bore her great-aunt's careful handwriting, "For my family, when the time comes to claim what is rightfully ours." The voices were getting closer now, but Maya felt a strange calm settle over her. Whatever came next, she finally understood why Aunt Iris had left her this land. The emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos as Maya paced the sterile hallway, her muddy clothes drawing concerned glances from passing nurses. Jake sat on an examination bed beyond the glass partition, his small frame dwarfed by the medical equipment surrounding him. Dr. Richardson, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, emerged from the room with a reassuring smile. "He's going to be fine," she said, placing a gentle hand on Maya's shoulder. "Mild hypothermia and exhaustion, but nothing that rest and warmth won't cure. We'll keep him overnight for observation, but you can take him home tomorrow." Maya's knees nearly buckled with relief. "Thank you. Can I see him?" "Of course. He's been asking for you." Inside the room, Jake looked impossibly small under the heated blankets, but his eyes were bright and alert. "Mom, I'm sorry I scared you, but you won't believe what we found down there." Before Maya could respond, Detective Carlos Martinez appeared in the doorway. She'd called him from the ambulance, knowing this discovery was far bigger than anything she could handle alone. His usually stern expression had softened with concern. "How's our young explorer?" he asked, approaching Jake's bedside. "I'm okay," Jake said eagerly. "Detective Martinez, there's a whole room down there, with boxes and papers and—" "Easy, buddy," Carlos said, pulling up a chair. "Start from the beginning." Jake launched into his story, describing the hidden entrance beneath the water, the air pocket chamber, and the waterproof containers filled with documents. Maya listened in amazement as her son recounted details that seemed impossible for an 8-year-old to notice, yet she knew every word was true. "The papers had names on them," Jake continued, his voice growing excited. "And there were pictures of people, and something about money being moved around. Mr. Thompson said it looked really important." Carlos exchanged a meaningful glance with Maya. "Jake, I need you to promise me something. Don't tell anyone else about this right now, okay? This needs to stay between us until we can figure out what it all means." "Is it bad stuff?" Jake asked, suddenly worried. "Not bad," Maya assured him, smoothing his damp hair. "Just complicated." After Jake had fallen asleep under the watchful eye of the nursing staff, Maya and Carlos retreated to the hospital cafeteria. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the empty tables as they sat with untouched cups of coffee. "Thompson's team has been working through the night," Carlos said quietly. "What Jake found, Maya, it's explosive. We're talking about evidence of money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud dating back 30 years. Some of the biggest names in the county are implicated. Maya stared into her coffee, trying to process the magnitude of what her son had stumbled upon. My Uncle Edgar, he must have known something, that's why he hid it. The documents suggest your uncle was an accountant for several prominent businesses. It looks like he discovered irregularities and started collecting evidence. There are photocopies of bank records, correspondence about offshore accounts, documentation of cash transactions that were never reported. But why hide it in the swamp? Why not go to the authorities? Carlos leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Look at some of these names, Maya. The former sheriff, the county commissioner, the district attorney from that era. Your uncle probably didn't know who he could trust. A chill ran down Maya's spine as the implications sank in. And now we have it. Now we have it, Carlos confirmed. The question is, what do we do with it? Some of these people are still alive, still in positions of power. This could destroy lives, end careers, send people to prison. Maya thought about Jake, sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware that his curiosity had unearthed a scandal that could shake their entire community. There are good people who were hurt by this, aren't there? People who lost money, who suffered because of what these men did? Probably. The statute of limitations has run out on most of the criminal charges, but there could still be civil implications. Restitution, justice, even if it's delayed. They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of responsibility settling between them like a physical presence. Maya thought about her struggles, the bills piling up, the constant worry about providing for Jake. Then she thought about other families who might have faced the same struggles because of the greed documented in those waterlogged files. We have to do the right thing, she said finally. Carlos nodded. I was hoping you'd say that. But Maya, you need to understand, this won't be easy. There will be pushback. Powerful people will try to discredit us, discredit the evidence. Your life is about to get very complicated. Maya looked toward the elevator that would take her back to Jake's room. Her son, who saw adventure where others saw danger, who found treasure where others saw worthless swampland. He'd taught her something important about courage. Let it get complicated, she said, standing up. Some things are worth fighting for. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up clouds of dust as it disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Sarah and Tommy standing in the humid silence of the swamp. The weight of what they'd just learned pressed down on Sarah's shoulders like the oppressive Louisiana heat. 40 years since Margaret Beaumont had vanished, and all this time she'd been resting beneath the ancient cypress where Tommy liked to skip stones. Mom? Tommy's voice was smaller than usual, his earlier excitement replaced by something more complicated. Are we in trouble? Sarah knelt beside her son, brushing a streak of mud from his cheek. No, sweetheart. You did the right thing. Margaret's family can finally have peace because of what you found. But even as she said the words, Sarah's mind raced with implications. The sheriff had been kind enough, but she'd caught the way his eyes lingered on their ramshackle trailer, the judgment in his expression when he'd asked how long they'd been living on the property. People would talk now. The discovery would bring attention she wasn't sure she wanted. Tommy wandered back toward the water's edge, drawn by some invisible force that had guided him since they'd first arrived at this strange inheritance. Sarah watched him crouch by the shoreline, his small hands trailing in the dark water as if listening for secrets only he could hear. There's something else down there, he said suddenly. Sarah's blood chilled. Tommy, no. We've done enough exploring for one day, maybe forever. But I can feel it. It's different from before. Not sad like Margaret was. This feels... He paused, his 8-year-old vocabulary struggling with concepts beyond his years. Important. Before Sarah could stop him, Tommy had pulled off his shoes and waded into the murky water. Panic seized her chest as she remembered the sheriff's warnings about alligators and snakes, but something in Tommy's posture held her back. He moved with purpose, as if following a map only he could see. The water reached his waist when he stopped and took a deep breath. Sarah's heart hammered as he disappeared beneath the surface, leaving only ripples to mark where he'd been. Seconds stretched into eternity before his head popped back up, gasping and triumphant. "Got it!" he called, holding something above his head as he struggled back to shore. What he placed in Sarah's trembling hands defied explanation. It was a metal box, maybe a foot long and half as wide, its surface green with decades of oxidation but still intact. Heavy brass corners and a complex lock suggested it had once been valuable, important enough for someone to protect. "Where exactly did you find this?" Sarah asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Same place as Margaret, but deeper, like it was hidden underneath her." Tommy's matter-of-fact delivery sent chills down Sarah's spine. "I think she was protecting it." Sarah turned the box over in her hands, noting the craftsmanship and the initials carved into the lid, JB. The metal was too corroded to open easily, but she could hear something shifting inside when she moved it. "We should call the sheriff back," she said, though her curiosity burned like fever. "Or we could see what's inside first," Tommy suggested with the logic of childhood. "Finders keepers, right?" Sarah almost smiled despite everything. "It doesn't work that way, baby. This belonged to someone who hid it in our swamp 40 years ago," Tommy pointed out. "Maybe they wanted us to find it." The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the cypress trees, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Sarah studied her son's earnest face, seeing her own stubborn determination reflected there. They'd come so far from their cramped apartment in Baton Rouge, from the endless cycle of bills and worry that had defined their lives before the lawyer's letter arrived. "All right," she said finally, "but we do this carefully. And if it looks like evidence of another crime, we call Sheriff Broussard immediately." Tommy's grin could have powered the entire parish. They carried the box back to the trailer, where Sarah found a screwdriver and began working at the corroded lock. The metal fought her at first, decades of swamp water having welded the mechanisms together, but eventually something gave way with a sharp click. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled cloth, lay treasures that made Sarah's breath catch. Jewelry that even her untrained eye recognized as valuable. Old photographs of people in elaborate clothing, and underneath it all, a leather portfolio tied with string that had somehow survived its watery grave. Tommy leaned against her shoulder as she carefully opened the portfolio, revealing documents that made her hands shake. Property deeds, bank records, and a handwritten letter dated just days before Margaret Beaumont's disappearance, explaining why she'd hidden her father's most precious possessions in the one place no one would think to look. The swamp had given up its secrets, and Sarah realized their lives were about to change in ways she'd never imagined. The morning sun cast long shadows across the swampland as Maya stood at the edge of what had once seemed like worthless inheritance. Now, with the truth about the underground railroad station beneath the murky waters finally revealed, everything had changed. The historian from the State University had left just an hour ago, promising that the documentation process would begin immediately. "Mom, look what I found." Tommy's voice carried across the water as he waded through the shallows near the old cypress tree. Even after everything they'd discovered, her son's curiosity remained undiminished. If anything, knowing the true significance of this place had only intensified his fascination with every hidden corner. Maya waded toward him, her boots squelching in the soft mud. The water was clearer today, as if the swamp itself had decided to reveal its secrets willingly. "What is it, sweetheart?" Tommy held up a small, tarnished metal object, roughly circular with intricate engravings barely visible beneath decades of corrosion. It was stuck in the roots of that big tree. "I think it might be important." Taking the artifact carefully, Maya turned it over in her palm. Despite the weathering, she could make out what appeared to be a compass rose and some kind of inscription around the edge. Her heart raced as she realized this could be another piece of the puzzle that had consumed their lives for the past weeks. "We need to call Dr. Hendricks," she said, referencing the historian who had become their primary contact with the university. This could be exactly what they need to authenticate the site completely. As they made their way back toward dry land, Maya's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but something prompted her to answer. "Miss Chen, this is Robert Fairweather from the National Park Service. Dr. Hendricks contacted us about your property. I understand you've made quite a remarkable discovery." Maya's grip tightened on the phone. The National Park Service meant federal involvement, which could be either wonderfully beneficial or completely overwhelming. "Yes, we've uncovered what appears to be a significant historical site. I'm calling because we'd like to arrange an official survey of the property. Based on the preliminary information we've received, your land may qualify for inclusion in the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. This would provide federal protection for the site and potentially significant funding for preservation and interpretation." The implications hit her like a wave. Federal protection meant the site would be preserved forever, but it also meant she might lose control over the property entirely. "What would that mean for my family? We live here." "That's exactly what we'd like to discuss. There are several options, including the possibility of your family serving as official caretakers of the site. In many cases, we work with property owners to create arrangements that benefit everyone involved." After ending the call, Maya found herself staring out over the swamp with mixed emotions. The financial security she desperately needed seemed within reach, but the thought of bureaucrats and tourists trampling through what had become their sanctuary felt overwhelming. Tommy splashed up beside her, having returned to his exploration while she talked. "Mom, there's something else. I think I found where people used to enter the underground station." Following her son through the tall grass, Maya discovered what appeared to be a partially collapsed tunnel entrance, hidden behind a natural curtain of hanging moss. The opening was small enough that it would have been easily missed by anyone not specifically looking for it. "The people who came through here," Tommy said quietly. "They must have been really scared." Maya knelt beside him, struck by the gravity in her 8-year-old's voice. Yes, they were. But they were also incredibly brave. They risked everything for freedom, like we did when we decided to stay here instead of going back to the city. The comparison caught her off guard, but she realized Tommy wasn't entirely wrong. They had taken an enormous risk by staying on this seemingly worthless property instead of returning to their old life. The difference was that their risk had been motivated by hope rather than desperation. "In a way, yes," she said, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. "Sometimes you have to take chances to find something better." As they walked back toward the house, Maya's mind raced with possibilities. The phone call from the Park Service had opened a door she hadn't even known existed. Instead of simply selling the property or struggling to develop it themselves, they might have found a third option, one that honored the historical significance of the site while providing for their future. The metal object Tommy had found seemed to grow warmer in her pocket, as if it carried the energy of all the stories yet to be told. Tomorrow would bring new decisions and new challenges, but for the first time since inheriting this mysterious swampland, Maya felt confident they were moving in the right direction. The swamp had indeed held treasures beyond anything she could have imagined, but the greatest discovery had been learning that, sometimes, the most valuable things couldn't be measured in dollars. The morning air hung thick with mist as Sarah stood at the edge of the swamp, watching the last of the FBI's evidence team pack up their equipment. Agent Martinez approached her, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "We've recovered most of what we need," he said, adjusting his jacket against the humid air. The cave system yielded more evidence than we hoped for. Bank records, correspondence, even some of the original stolen artifacts. Vincent Carruthers built quite the operation down there. Sarah nodded, still processing everything that had unfolded. 3 days ago, she'd been worried about next month's rent. Now she was standing in the middle of what the FBI was calling one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Louisiana's history. "What happens to us now?" she asked, glancing back toward the cabin where Jake was helping Dr. Reeves catalog some of the less sensitive artifacts they'd been allowed to keep. Martinez smiled, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him since this whole ordeal began. "Well, The good news is that you're not in any legal trouble. Your great-uncle's crimes don't extend to you, and everything we've found confirms that Vincent acted alone in the theft and subsequent cover-up. The statute of limitations ran out decades ago anyway. And the land. Still yours. In fact, given the historical significance of what your son discovered, the state's very interested in working with you. Dr. Reeves has been advocating for you quite passionately, actually. As if summoned by his name, Dr. Reeves emerged from the cabin, his arms full of carefully wrapped artifacts. Jake bounced alongside him, chattering excitedly about pottery shards and arrowheads. The transformation in her son over the past week had been remarkable. The quiet, withdrawn boy who'd spent most of his time with his nose buried in adventure books had become animated and confident, speaking knowledgeably about archaeological techniques and Native American history. "Sarah!" Dr. Reeves called out, his weathered face bright with enthusiasm. "I've just gotten off the phone with the university. They're prepared to offer you a substantial finder's fee for the artifacts. Plus, they want to discuss a long-term partnership for excavating the site." Jake ran up to her, his eyes shining. "Mom, Dr. Reeves says I can be his official junior assistant, and the university wants to set up a scholarship fund for kids who discover important historical stuff." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the sudden shift in their fortunes. But it was Jake's happiness that mattered most. For the first time in months, maybe years, she saw her son truly excited about something real, something that didn't involve escaping into books or video games. Agent Martinez cleared his throat. "There is one more thing. We've been in contact with several museums about the stolen artifacts. Most of them are planning to offer substantial rewards for their return. Nothing's final yet, but we're talking about enough money to secure your son's college education, at minimum." Dr. Reeves set down his armload of artifacts and pulled out a thick folder. "I've also been in touch with the State Historical Society. They're proposing to designate this entire area as a protected archaeological site, with you as the primary landowner liaison. It comes with an annual stipend, plus housing allowances to maintain the property." Sarah looked around at the swampland that had seemed like such a burden just days ago. The morning mist was beginning to lift, revealing the ancient cypress trees that had stood sentinel over Vincent's secrets for so many years. She could hear the gentle lapping of water against the hidden cave entrance where her great-uncle had spent decades guarding his stolen treasures. "Mom?" Jake tugged at her sleeve. "Are you okay?" She knelt down to his level, studying his face. There was dirt under his fingernails from helping with the excavation and a small scratch on his cheek from navigating through the underbrush, but his eyes were alive with purpose in a way she hadn't seen since his father died. "I'm more than okay, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. You know that, right? What you discovered down there, it's going to help a lot of people learn about the history of this place." Jake grinned and threw his arms around her neck. "It was like finding real treasure, Mom. Just like in the adventure books, but better because it's real." Agent Martinez began walking toward his car, then turned back. "Mrs. Chen, for what it's worth, your great-uncle may have made some terrible choices as a young man, but he spent the rest of his life protecting something important. In his own way, I think he was trying to make amends." As the FBI vehicles disappeared down the dirt road, Sarah stood with her son and Dr. Reeves, looking out over their transformed world. The swamp stretched before them, no longer a burden or a mystery, but a bridge between past and future, holding stories waiting to be told and dreams waiting to be fulfilled. The morning sun filtered through the Spanish moss as Maya stood on the newly constructed dock, watching Tommy cast his fishing line into the dark water. 3 months had passed since they'd discovered the Confederate gold cache, and their world had transformed in ways she never could have imagined. The swampland no longer felt like a burden or a mysterious inheritance from her great-aunt Cordelia. It had become home. With careful planning and the help of historical preservation experts, they'd managed to keep most of the gold while ensuring the Civil War artifacts found their way to the appropriate museums. The story had made national news, but Maya had insisted on maintaining their privacy, especially Tommy's. "Mom, look!" Tommy called out, reeling in a small bass. His excitement was infectious, and Maya couldn't help but smile. The fearless boy who had first ventured into these waters had grown more confident, but he'd also learned respect for the swamp's hidden dangers. Dr. Elizabeth Thorne emerged from the restored cabin behind them, carrying 3 cups of coffee and hot chocolate. The historian had become not just a trusted advisor, but a close friend. Her expertise had been invaluable in authenticating their discovery and navigating the complex legal waters that followed. "Any luck this morning?" Elizabeth asked, settling into one of the wooden chairs they'd placed on the dock. "Tommy's caught 2 so far," Maya replied, accepting the warm cup gratefully. "He says the fish are telling him their secrets." It was a running joke between them now. After everything they'd uncovered, Tommy's intuitive connection to the swamp had become legendary in their small circle. The treasure had been just the beginning. Working with archaeologists and historians, they'd learned that their land sat atop what had once been a crucial stop on the Underground Railroad, decades before the Confederate soldiers had hidden their gold there. The cabin renovation had revealed hidden compartments and coded messages left by abolitionists. Each discovery added another layer to their understanding of the property's rich, complex history. Maya often wondered if Cordelia had known all along, leaving cryptic clues in her will that only someone willing to truly explore would uncover. "Mrs. Henderson called this morning," Elizabeth said, pulling out her phone. "The documentary crew wants to schedule another interview next week." Maya nodded thoughtfully. They'd been careful about media exposure, but the story was too significant to hide completely. The discovery had shed new light on Civil War history in Louisiana, and several universities were now funding research projects on their land. "As long as they respect our boundaries," Maya said. "This is still our home first." The financial security the gold had provided was life-changing, but Maya had been deliberate about not letting it change who they were. Tommy still attended the same school, though now she could afford tutoring to help with his reading. They'd kept their small apartment in town while making the swamp cabin livable for weekends and summers. "Mom, can we check the traps today?" Tommy asked, securing his fishing rod. The traps were actually carefully placed underwater cameras they used to monitor the swamp's wildlife. What had started as Tommy's curiosity about what lived beneath the surface had evolved into a genuine conservation effort. They'd documented several species that researchers hadn't expected to find in this area. "After lunch," Maya promised. "Elizabeth wants to show us something she found in the archives yesterday." Elizabeth's eyes lit up. "I think I've identified the Union soldier who left that final message in the cave. His name was Samuel Morrison, and he survived the war. His great-grandson still lives in Baton Rouge. The cave where Tommy had first discovered the gold had yielded many secrets. Hidden beneath layers of sediment, they'd found evidence of its use by multiple groups over decades. The Union soldier's message, carved into the stone, had spoken of hope and justice prevailing. It had become something of a family motto for them. As the day warmed, they made their way through the familiar paths Tommy had first blazed months ago. The swamp felt different now that they understood its history, but it remained as mysterious and beautiful as ever. Maya often reflected on how close they'd come to selling the land without ever exploring it. "Look," Tommy whispered, pointing to a great blue heron standing motionless near the water's edge. They stopped, respecting the bird's stillness. In these quiet moments, Maya felt the presence of all who had come before them. The freedom seekers who had found sanctuary here, the soldiers who had hidden their secrets, and Cordelia, who had somehow known that this place needed guardians who would honor its past while embracing its future. The heron took flight, its wings casting shadows across the water. As they continued deeper into their swamp, Maya realized that the greatest treasure hadn't been the gold at all. It had been learning that sometimes the most unexpected inheritances come with the power to change not just your circumstances, but your entire understanding of where you belong in the world.